So,
Cool. Well, I've
good.
got
So,
about an hour and 10 minutes.
okay, that's
So
perfect.
if we can't talk about 45 pages in an hour and 10 minutes,
Yeah,
um, we must be two pastors.
that's right. All right, so how do you want to start it?
I was just hoping you were going to say that. So it has
Oh,
been a while since we've caught up, since we've chatted. Um, that break took that break was a break. It was a big break. Um, and we're going through this patient ferment book. And before we do that, so we did a special edition of this on that um, Richard Dawkins video
mhm.
last year, um, and I'm going to bring us back to the patient. I'm going to get there. Um, have you heard of? There's a podcast called "The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God" with Justin Brierly. Have you heard of that podcast by any chance?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay. Um, yeah. So basically, it is that kind of talk. He's a guy who's a Christian, and his basic premise of life, I think, fits in with with all the things that we're talking about. Is um, our culture and society are more Christian than we would like to believe, and that might be lowercase c. It is probably is. We should just say that it is
Yeah.
lowercase c. Christianized. Our culture is
Yeah.
more Christianized than what we would like to see. And now we're starting to reap all of the benefits of trying to live in a lowercase c Christianized society without the foundation of the uppercase C
Mhm.
Christ. It's a good podcast. I recommend it, and I just think that has import, that has value for what we're talking about today in our book of. So we're in chapter 3, um, the push and the pull, and I really like the way that this set it up. Like, um, I think this is what I sent you. This is what a picture I sent you.
Yeah.
On page 38, it says, so basically, it's like, why do people become Christians? What in the existing religious options so dissatisfied some people that it pushed their adherents to explore new options? And then what was it in Christianity that so attracted people that it pulled them to explore something that might be very costly?
Mhm.
So I think the answer to the first question is, like, for us, what's pushing the adherents of our current culture and narrative to explore something else. And I think that is the like the un um culture unmoored, like a Christianized culture unmoored from the foundation of Christ. I think that's the push. Like, people are realizing that this isn't working. Um, but then the other question is, like, what was it about Christianity that then pulled them into something else? And I think that's really been like our biggest bit of dialogue and our biggest bit of conversation on this, of like, why what was it about the early church that was attractive? um what made the early church, I'll use modern language, what made the early church seeker sensitive,
Mm.
um in bringing those people in? And I think that's a flip of the way that we would probably normally think of something being seeker sensitive,
Right. Right.
um, because it wasn't a watered down version
Mm.
of Christianity. It was a, like, no, hardcore, like, this is going to require all of you kind of a thing. Um, and then you enter in the life change, you enter in the habitus, you enter in the, I don't know.
Yep.
practices, the spiritual disciplines, and all of those kinds of things.
Oh,
Comment.
okay. I have many thoughts.
I knew you would.
It's funny because this chapter actually, there are things I would debate with him. I'd like to know what he meant when he said it. Like he talks about right off the beginning, he talks about Roman society being, what does he call it? He calls it tolerant. I guess religiously tolerant. In fact, he says infinitely tolerant. And I thought maybe, depending on what you're trying to say, because it wasn't tolerant to Christianity. I mean, at all. And that, they proves that.
Yeah,
And I think his point was like it was probably more um multifaceted as long as you didn't violate the principles because
right.
these people
Yeah,
these people weren't, they were religious. They believed what they did. There's stories about I wish I could pull one up and talk about it, but I've been told, there's stories about when, they would go to battle and the people would make sacrifices to whatever god, because they would offer this as a way to appease the god. And sometimes they would give
mm,
sacrifices to the gods of the enemy, hoping to win them over to their side. And then the battle would go wrong. Then it'd go back and there's stories of them throwing rocks at the statues
mm,
the idols essentially of the gods whom they had given sacrifice. So they were serious and they get seriously angry when things didn't work the way they thought. So there were people that were serious about what they believed. And Christians, I don't know if he even mentions it in here, but Christians were considered atheists in
yeah.
the Roman Empire, right? So he probably
Well,
gets
and
into.
yeah, and I think that that's a good distinctive. They were when we went through Romans a few years ago. They were considered atheists not because they believed in God, their God, but they didn't believe that Caesar was God.
Mhm.
So, so I think what you're getting at is the infinite tolerance comes in. Like you can practice whatever you want to, as long as your ultimate, as long as you accept the ultimate authority of Caesar
So not infinitely
as God.
tolerant. So I think saying infinitely tolerant is
Sure, yeah,
is a stretch,
with
but I
a
get what he's going for.
yeah, but also I think like even from even our culture functions very similarly to
Mhm.
that, and as long as we can worship, we can do whatever we want to, as long as our ultimate narrative is like, as long as you don't go against the official narrative of the culture, you
Yeah.
are free to worship however you want to, and that
Yep.
and that worship and that narrative of the culture obviously is subjective, and it's a
Yep.
moving target. And um, especially in thinking about um, like sex and gender issues,
Hmm.
um, like our culture and now our government has set what that narrative is, and to push against that,
Yep.
like you can be a Christian, you just keep it into your category, like worship God however you want to, as long as you worship the ultimate narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. No, and I think that actually translates pretty well, obviously, to our
Mm-hmm,
day, like you said.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
It's I mean going through this too, is especially, the many thoughts that come up. He brings up obviously in this um the lives of the martyrs, which are, I mean, sadly not very well known. But like he brings up Felicity and Perpetua and those with them who are commemorated in our church on February 1st. So we're coming up on the day that those people that he mentions actually will have there's a feast that celebrates them. Um, but the cost, like the thing that always gets me, because I'll talk about, we'll have, on like Saturday night we have great vespers in our church. So we serve a service, and oftentimes after that service I'll speak about, like, not all the time but sometimes, whatever the saint is for that day. And oftentimes it's a martyr. It just happens to be the case. And I'm always kind of amazed that when you read their stories, it's like, how do you get to the point where you're willing to not just die like, some heroic guy who, is dying in the foxhole, but he straps a bomb onto himself and the enemy's coming over the foxhole and he blows them all up and kills himself. Not to just die heroically to save your companions, but you die in a way that on the surface of things looks pointless and weak, in a sense,
Hmm.
to die in
Hmm.
an arena and you're, in the power of Christ to transform people into such a place where they are actually seeking this sort of death out. It sounds totally insane to us, but it was not to them at that time. So it's like when you read these stories where people, actual Christians, were saying, I want to die as a martyr for Christ. Like, how do we even begin to comprehend that now? Because now we really don't. Our martyrdoms are very small. So like reading this is interesting. I mean, he uses that word habitus. I would totally change that to tradition. I mean,
Hmm.
constantly, I'd replace it with tradition almost every time he uses it because, and I think I would almost argue that I think out of concern for people's response to the word tradition, which gets maligned and it shouldn't be, that's all he's talking about. Building, not just building a tradition, but entering into something. Tradition means to hand something that you have down to the next person, and
Hmm.
they stick with that. They don't change it, or if there's change, it's change that's done for the right reasons, you might say. Um, but building, I get the idea of the habitus. You're building a regular habit of doing certain things. Um, but then you have this tradition that's actually bigger than you are. So it's something that
Right.
you enter into. Um, so the push and the pull, I think it's interesting because I think you have to have both. I think probably when they started seeing the lives of Christians, you saw Christians, like he brought it up in here too, who would go out of the way to help the poor, the disenfranchised, the sick in ways that just, shocked the culture. People could see that there was a difference in the Christians by what they did, by their works, full stop.
Yeah.
And that's what really was pushing them away. I mean, in part, I think was pushing
Hmm.
them away from where they came from, where they could see, on one hand, you get what you want, but then there's a price to pay for it that they realized. I think people were starting to realize they didn't want to pay, and was pulling them to these people who were, exhibiting a real side of holiness. I mean, what else can you say about it?
Right.
So yeah, habitus, tradition,
Hmm.
the early life of the church.
Yeah. One of the
It
things that's kind of on my mind as I was reading through that is like just the a bit of the relationship between, and I don't know, this is probably a very, like, I'm about to say this is probably a very Western way to think. Um, like the relationship between like obedience and heart change. Like, does the obedience of the practice, does the doing the practice, like, does that lead to the heart change? I think sometimes we in our in probably more West. I don't know. I guess I'm now a man. Now I've used the word, so now I should just stick to it.
Mhm.
For those of us in Western Christianity, I think there's this feeling of like I don't want to commit. I can't commit to this because my heart isn't all in it. Like I want to really believe this before I do that thing. I'm like maybe so to a fault, maybe so overly concerned about what my motivation is. I'm led by my motivation, and if my motivation isn't right, then I can't. Then how can God? Like, if my motivation is wrong, how can God possibly accept what I'm my obedient act as an obedient act, because he knows my inner, what's going on inside of me. And I think um I think so much of that is like I get that, but also um our obedience is required, and I think God utilizes our obedience to bring about heart change. Like it
Mhm.
is a relationship.
Yeah. Well, you think about people getting married. We both
Mm.
got married young. Um,
That's
I
a really
thought,
great illustration.
I mean, it really it is because people think they know their spouse. They think they love their
Mm,
spouse. And I mean, I knew Anne, you knew Katie, and but it really certainly wasn't. I mean, I tell people this all the time, especially like if I'm talking about marriage or counseling them. It was probably 15 years in before I we could look at each other and go, we really do have a good relationship here. Like before that, it wasn't that we wouldn't say that, but it was about that point where it was like, oh, look at this, and it was by faithfully remaining together, working through all the difficulties, not caving into the temptations to do other things. Um, and then you learn, you enter into it. When people come to our church, in the Orthodox form of worship, there's you've seen it. I mean, there's lots to do, and I tell them, if you want to understand why we do what we do, then just do it. Like just go do it.
yeah,
Do that
yeah,
first.
sure.
So, and I understand why there would be reticence. So we have icons, in our church. There's discussion about that to be had, and we make the sign of the cross. We kiss the icons because we want to honor the person to whom this icon is made, to remember this person, like you would kiss a picture of your family member before you went to bed. It's the same idea. And I tell people like they'll say, well, I don't really understand it. And I'll say, well, if you're not opposed to it, then just go do it and you'll figure it out. And that's really, and I think what it is, I do think
Mm,
in Western, especially Western mindsets of worship, particularly when it comes to God, we're not going to figure it all out. I mean, you think about it,
mm,
we don't, we're fooling ourselves when we think, we were saying it before, I was thinking about this. We're fooling ourselves if we think we know ourselves or even our motives. I don't know them.
mm,
There's my cat. There she is
mm.
back there.
Yeah, no, I love it.
Um, yeah, she's taken over. Um, it's my parishioner's cat. We're fooling ourselves if we think we know
Mm,
ourselves. People come, we have confession. They come to
mm,
confession,
mm,
and I ask them, like, I have a little document I use. I said, look at this document. Think about think about what's been going on with you. What have you done? Like, I don't want to hear like necessarily, I struggle with this or, I should be doing this. I just say what you did. I lied, you know, and you're not telling me, you're telling the Lord, and I'm just here as a
sure.
witness. So that, and I say that to say, we want to be about what we're doing. But even in confession, when you think you're dealing with your sins, you still don't know all of it. You don't know the half of it. You don't know a tenth of it. So we're always depending on the Lord's mercy, and we're always depending on Him um, to uh, to complete what's lacking in us. So there's always that faith in that. But still, we're always entering into sort of the mystery of what we're doing. Like, light at our church, light a candle. Well, what do you light a candle for? It's a prayer. Say a prayer when you light the candle. Well, can I just say the prayer without the candle? Well, absolutely. But wouldn't you rather pick up the candle and light it and you say the prayer with it and there's the candle burning in front of you? You can see it, you
Mm.
can smell it. It's beeswax, and you can pray. So
It's like a tangible
but yeah,
expression.
but at the same time, the funny thing is, and this is where it gets different than Western thinking. We talk about things being symbol, and we tend to think the
Mm,
symbol's false, but it's a picture of a real thing. But the reality is that the two go together. So the candle itself is, I mean, it can't help but be an aspect of the very prayer that we're offering. So there's like what he talks about in here, I think is really interesting. It's very interesting to me that a Mennonite, writer would see this stuff and kind of talk about it because it is so much and it's what we do. What we do has everything to do with what we believe. But like you said, your question was more about like kind of which comes first. Probably both of them
yeah,
can come
yeah,
first, and but obedience and the act, we got to get past the idea that we got to get it all figured out before we do it. We need to do the
yeah,
thing, enter into it, and then trust that God will bring the meaning to us in the process.
yeah. And I would, yeah, I completely agree with you on that of not getting stuck in that motivational thing because at some point that sort of becomes an excuse for not following through
Yeah,
on the obedience, or it can.
yeah,
I mean, again,
yeah.
I really liked about like what you said about not knowing what our motivations are, and I just thought of Psalm 139. Search my heart, O God, search me, O God, know my heart. test me and know my anxious thoughts. Like that's a real,
Yep.
that's a real cry from David of someone who like, I don't know what I feel. I don't know what
Yeah.
I think. I don't know. And I think that's just a really good place of like, there are times where we don't know that. And
Hmm.
what, I mean, the example, at least in 130, in Psalm 139, then is to go to God and ask him to reveal that to us.
Hmm.
Um, we're going through we've been going through Daniel for a while. We're picking it back up in February, and at the end of Daniel 8, like he has a vision. It's his second vision, and like Daniel 8 kind of ends with like he went back and he continued to serve King Belshazzar, but he was still troubled. And like I think I find that like that's a really that seems like a completely normalized human thing to like I don't understand everything, I don't know everything, and like I just need to do the thing that God calls me to do.
Hmm.
I don't have to know everything in order to do what God calls me to do.
Well, it's a deeply uncomfortable place to be, especially if we're rational Westerners. It's like we've got to have it all figured out.
Right.
And the good news and the bad news is the closer you draw to God, the further he is away from you. Because the closer you get, the bigger, more complex, and the more mystery you find.
Mm-hmm.
You're coming,
Mm-hmm.
the Psalms talks about, basically the Lord being the cloud of darkness. There's an ancient writer, Dionysius, that sometimes people wrongly call pseudo Dionysius, which is just false. But he's attributed.
I see
Yeah,
what you
there you
did
go. There you go. But he's attributed
there.
with writing
Sorry.
this whole thing where he talks about the darkness of unknowing. Like the closer you draw to God, the more you realize you can't draw, he's uncircumscribable. You can't draw a circle around him and say, this is everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good for us, but it's deeply uncomfortable because mystery it's become popular now, especially with Orthodoxy kind of making, bigger waves, I guess. But it's not like it's the reality that everything is Christ, everything is faith. In the moment we start to trust in all the decisions we make or what we think about ourselves, like I use confession as an example. When people come to confession in our church, they stand with the priest, they stand before the Lord. The priest is a witness of what this person has to confess. And, I'm there, they talk with me, but they're talking with the Lord at the same time is the idea. And like sometimes they'll come with a list of sins like I did, and like they'll go to the other extreme, like I said, I just say what it is. Well, they'll say what it is, but they'll feel like the feeling is, in order for confession to be what it's supposed to be, I got to make sure I say all the sins. And I'm like, we call it scrupulosity, and it's not how it's supposed to work. And so I'm like, not that I want you to skip anything, but just realize you don't know yourself. You're going to miss stuff, and you're going to actually actively, even though you don't even realize this, probably not bring stuff up that probably ought to be brought up. But we're in this for the long game. So
Sure.
at some
Sure.
point, the Lord, working with the Lord, um, it will come to light. So I think that's one of the things where I think if we're basing, I mean, one of the things he's getting into that's really good. He's realizing like it was their habitus. It was the things that they were doing regularly that was transforming them, and that was a witness to the world around them. And that in the process of doing these things, like they're converted pagans, right? So there's this long period of conversion that they had to do to become Christians, usually 3 years of catechesis, to
Mm-hmm.
pump out all the sludge and to teach them, like we said, I think one of the meetings, like, hey, by the way, incest is actually wrong. Oh, really? I didn't know that. Pederasty is wrong. Oh, you got to be kidding me. I didn't know that. You know what I mean? This is the horrible stuff that the Romans, Roman culture
Right.
had normalized. So after all this time, they were finally coming around, and the change was so radical, and I think stood out because we're so used to a Christianized society, like you said. I mean, small c Christianized,
Mm-hmm.
that we don't even really get it, like how stark the difference was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, it was a big deal.
Um, I I think I think my next question is going to be related to this. Like on page 41, it kind of talks about um, those who aren't reading the book.
Yep.
Christian communities work to transform the habitus of those who were candidates for membership, tinkering with their wiring and even attempting a more far reaching rewiring by two means: catechesis, which is what you're talking about, which rehabituated the candidate's behavior by means of teaching and relationship, and worship, the community's ultimate counterformative act, in
Yep.
which the new habitus was enacted and expressed with bodily, okay,
Hmm.
eloquence.
Yep.
Um, like you said a minute ago, and we've talked about this and we've talked around it in the past. Um, this was something I just listened to and where I'm at in this podcast I was telling you about. Like the right now, there seems to be like the as people are recognizing the as people are recognizing what culture looks like unmoored from capital C Christianity, they the like the move seems to be to get back to more like more traditional Christianity,
Mm. Yep.
forms of Christianity, specifically like Orthodoxy and even Catholicism. I
Yep.
think there's
Definitely.
kind of a like your the Catholic and or the Orthodox star seems to be rising a bit
Yep.
culturally. Uh, and then a minute ago you said you talked about mystery and being okay with mystery. Some questions that I wrote in my book. I wrote so if this is the case, should we then be see how countercultural we can be? Is the draw is this the draw to orthodoxy as a belief? Is that like that countercultural, that counterformative act? Like, is that reason why? And I'm wondering, like, as you are maybe seeing a higher interest in orthodoxy, and what what kind of concerns maybe do you see in like because I think it would be very normal, like let's and well, I think this was normal 20 plus years ago, 30 years ago, um the move towards evangelicalism, the megachurch movement, like hey, we got all these people coming, this thinking rules, this is going to be awesome and amazing. And now for whatever those things were that were quote unquote pulling people into the church, like people have realized that has not, and this can be really consumeristic, so I just mean this, I'm gonna say this, and I'm gonna
Mhm.
mean it in the best way possible. Like what I thought I was getting in Christianity isn't fulfilling me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious, as more and more people express interest in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, like is that something that you've thought about? Of man, we're okay. We've got all these people coming. Like, if they're looking for a mystery, or they're looking kind of to tap into some ancient thing. Like, what does that look like for you to not be in a place 20 years ago or 20 years
Mhm.
from now where it was like, oh man, I was really looking for this mystery and I was liking the mystery, but I wasn't really seeking capital C Christ. I was seeking lowercase c fulfillment. Do,
Yeah.
do, you, do you understand my
Yeah.
question? Do you know what I'm getting
Totally.
at?
Yeah. 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 Because I mean, it's the big question right now. You read, there was somebody sent me an article from Yahoo News recently. I've gotten two articles now that different people have written about specifically about Orthodoxy and people coming in what we would consider to be large numbers to the Orthodox Church seeking something. the article brought up the issue of masculinity, like a
Mm,
masculine, non-feminine
yes.
religion. Okay, and
Yeah.
that's fair enough. I mean, a lot of priests kind of mock that. Well, I mean, even among us, we're like, "What are you talking about?" You know. But at the same time, they ought to know what's going on there. So it's something that is it's it's fine. If people, I came to Orthodoxy with all kinds of other ideas when I came in. When I
Sure.
came to the church, though, my priest was quick to kind of go, okay, that's all well and good. Here's what we do here. Here's what we do. And so when people come to us, I mean, it is a concern for us because people are going to come with the push of being sometimes saying, I don't like where I came from. They're ordaining women, or they're normalizing homosexual relationships as if this is like the norm. And so I'm looking for something that won't do that. And so when they come to us, I'm like, well, yeah, okay, we're not going to do that. But that's all well and good. But what we need to do is transform that push to the right pull. Like you're going to come
Mm,
here, but you won't stay. You're not going to stay here unless you transform those those ideas to being a Christian, like really living a Christian life and being a Christian, because that's what's going to keep you here. Because nothing, I mean, nobody wants to fast like we fast. Nobody wants to have, you know, services in the morning on weekdays. And no, not that everybody's going to go to all these things, but, nobody wants to, I don't know. That's not totally true. Some people would want things that are different. There's an exoticness to us in America when you
yeah.
encounter Orthodoxy. That's fine. But converting that to relationship, to have union with God, that's what's going to keep people in. So really, it is a concern because when people come to us, like right now, I have probably, we only have our church is small. So we only have maybe, I don't know, 80-ish people that are really there regularly. And of those, probably we have maybe 15 people that are what we would call inquirers or catechumens. And of those that haven't moved away, because I keep losing them through moving recently, we probably have 5 people who are serious about it. But they'll come, especially young men these days, and they're reading things online, and they're feeling disaffected, and they're feeling very lost. And the ones who do best are the ones who come in and say, I kind of don't know what to believe. And so they're already kind of in a place where you can say, well, okay, well, this is what we believe. Do you want this? And then the poll can start or it doesn't. And if they don't want it, they're welcome to stay. We'll feed them lunch on Sundays and they can come around for services if they just like the look of candles, that sort of thing, if that's what they're about. Not that we want that. But the concern is, I'm trying to think what your original question was really. The concern is helping to helping to change helping them to change their own hearts in a sense. Like not just them, but Christ working in them to bring them to a place where it's funny because that passage you read, I highlighted it too and I underlined it. Catechesis is a subtext, I think, in the Orthodox Church to worship. And worship is something that we do constantly. It doesn't stop. But then it's formalized, and we have these ways that we can all enter into it together in a regular pattern that then change us by doing them. So, am I answering the question? I'm trying to think of what you
Yes.
were,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think, I mean, ultimately, I don't know, it's one of the Johns. I get them all. I get
Mhm,
the
mhm,
Johns confused. Like one of the, like somewhere in one of those Johns,
mhm.
John writes, like, like they went away from us because, or they went out of us because they really weren't of us.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, from certainly from an evangelical side, and I'm not talking about like Westway Christian Church. Um, when I contextualize that, but I certainly feel like, yeah, I mean, there probably were a lot of people who who came into the church and they've since went away from us, and the reality is, like, they really weren't one of us. Like,
Mm.
regardless of what
Yeah.
regardless of what their involvement and engagement was, there's probably a deeper, well, there is I would argue, there's a deeper level spirituality that says, yeah, but they really weren't believers. Like at the most bottom level, like they really just weren't believers. And just that for as I guess 20 years from now, it'll be an interesting social experiment to,
Yeah.
you know, hopefully I mean I know what your desire is that people have an encounter with Christ and they're
Mm,
transformed by him,
mm.
and that's my desire. And if all you're looking for, I think, is a church that's not going to bow to current cultural norms, like it's just not going to be enough
No.
to to bring about the transformation that you really need in your life, which is you submitting to like the lordship of Jesus. Like it's good to be in a place that doesn't bow to current cultural norms, but at the end of the day, like that ain't going to be enough to sustain you.
Well, it's like going, you need surgery.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
you go to the hospital, you go into the
mm.
emergency room. Let's say you cut yourself pretty seriously, you know, and you go to the emergency room, you register, you're in the right place, but you're like, this is, I don't really want to see the doctor, and you might have your reasons. Um, and you sit in the emergency room and you just sort of never go beyond that. Where's the healing going to happen? You're in the right place, you've chosen the right thing, and it feels a lot like the hospital, because it's got the nurses walking in and out, and you see the ambulances and stretchers, but you're not actually going to commit to the process of healing and encountering the doctor and making the changes. I mean, and it's interesting because it's not that we don't talk about things in terms of is someone a believer or not. Not that that's a bad term. We, we baptize and chrismate people. So they want this. We ask them, like, is this what you want? Because when you do this, you're bringing yourself, you are becoming a part of the church. You're committing yourself to Christ. And the commitment goes from him to you, but you to him. And you're free. You can walk away, but there's consequences of these things. So for us, it's like it's interesting. A person when they come to the Orthodox Church and they say, "I want to become Orthodox," and I say it's going to be a year of us talking about these things. I'm not holding you back from salvation. That's usually the impression. They're like, "Well, if you don't do this, that means I go to hell." And no, 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 no. We don't even get
Sure,
there. We take time. This is the Lord knows what he's doing. No one's in hell that doesn't want to be there. That's our perspective. People choose that. Um, Otherwise, where would love be? But take your time. We're gonna take our time, and when it's time to receive the person in the service for the baptism, there's baptism, and then after the baptism is what we call chrismation. It's anointing with holy oil. It's the imparting of the Holy Spirit. It's our tradition. And at the baptism, you ask the person two or three questions, which you repeat several times. Have you what is it? Have you I can't think of the words, this baptism service. Essentially, have you rejected the devil? Have you rejected all his works and all his deeds and everything else? And you say, I have whatever. I can't think. It's funny, I can't think of it off the top of my head sitting here. And then we actually have the person turn and face what we call face west, towards away from east is always reorient, orient is always the godly direction, and west, sorry for the west, is the ungodly direction. So they turn and
reset.
face west, and it's awesome because we say, then turn and spit on him. So we have the person who's going to be baptized, they turn, they face west, and they spit on the devil. I say spit, get some spit, because we're spitting on them. Very, for the Middle Easterner or the Asian person, they really get this. Then I have them turn around and reorient themselves to the east at this point, and we say, have you united yourself to Christ? I have united myself to Christ. They haven't even been baptized yet, and we ask them over and over. We have them kneel and read the creed, which is a confession of what they believe. It's just an enumeration of what Christians believe, whether you guys use that or not. And then we baptize them. And then after we baptize them, they come up out of the font. We have them put on, if we've got them, white robes, but they'll dry off. And then we anoint them with holy oil. And they say, the whole point of this is they say very few things, like hardly anything at all. They say the creed, which they've been taught, and they've been taught what it means and why they're saying it, and they have to be willing to say it. They have to say it the one way it's said. They spit on the devil. They unite themselves to Christ by word. And then after that, they're baptized, they're chrismated, they start to take communion, they're a part of the church, and anything can happen. I've watched people do a whole thing and just days later walk away and never come back again. Like after all the work you put into them. Um, you just don't know. I mean, what does that mean? I think that's as close as we get to seeing what St. Paul's saying. Like, they or St. John, they were among us, but they weren't of us. They weren't a part of who we were. And I think you can leave and come back. I mean, it's possible. So, but it's a frightening thing. Um, I don't know why I was saying all that. I guess that was just getting at that whole idea of like, initiation into the faith. It's no small thing. And it really isn't about, at least from our perspective, it's not what I say about it.
Yeah.
It's not my testimony. I mean, really, in the end of the day, what does it really matter other than me saying, I reject these things, I accept these things, and now I'm going to have other people do this stuff to me, baptism, chrismation, commune, and I'm going to enter into it. And then by having that sort of poured on me, then I can also kind of pour it out of myself too. I don't know if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. It does. Yeah.
But man, is it frustrating these days. People are so weird. They come to your church and you're just like, okay, how can we deprogram this person? I don't know where this came from. That's the thing.
Hmm.
I'm sure
Hmm.
you've seen that. I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else you got here? I'm trying to think what else I wanted to approach.
I really liked, um, so I remember when I read through this the first time, I found the Passion on PDF and downloaded it and read it. And, um, yeah, the other quote, I have two things that I want to talk about. I have two more things I want to talk about. Um, just that little quote that I sent you about, the night before they, like they celebrate like the agape meal, like they celebrate
Mhm.
the Lord's Supper. Looked up, saw the outsiders, addressed them, expressing their joy and suffering, warning them of God's judgment, and inviting them the next day to recognize them in the amphitheater. Like I love that so much. Like,
Yeah.
hey, um, we're doing this because this is an opportunity for us to suffer for Christ. God is going to just punish the living crap out of you for being a part of it, and
Look out. Yeah.
and then you should come and watch because it's going to be amazing. Like
Mhm.
I just think like that is so like usually when we invite people um to come and watch something and come and participate in something, like, hey, it's going to be awesome. Like, come and watch this sporting event. You've shared before, how you've gone to some, I think, some graduations out at Paris Island.
Yep.
You know, like,
Yep.
hey, come and watch this. Like, this is really going to be cool. And like that same, hey, come and watch this because we're all going to die tomorrow. And
Yep.
it is going to be glorious
Yep.
in that. And I did not underline or highlight that the first time I read it, but when I reread through this yesterday, I was just like, man, that like I just love that so much. Like this is going to be an amazing day. You should come and watch.
Well, like
Like,
you
you're
think
going to see something special.
that's what you think about the martyrs. They were just there. I don't think we can relate to them because these, I mean, obviously even the story, the passion of Felicity and Perpetua and those with them is like you see there's pain in it. They experience
Mm-hmm.
pain and struggle. And oftentimes you read, it's really interesting when you read a lot of the stories of the saints. A number of them, and we take this to be true. I mean, this is true. We would say true history. A number of them were tortured. I mean, just the tortures that are listed, they'll keep those records. And a number of them, after they're bodily injured, like terribly injured, they'd be thrown back in jail, probably with the thought this person's just going to die. And the Lord would send an angel, would heal them completely, and the jailers would come in the morning, and there they are, completely wound free. And they're like, wow, like what happened? So you have these moments where you got the arena where they're killed, just they're killed, and it's glorious. Their deaths are glorious, and it really took the wind out of the sails for the people watching. They're looking
Yeah.
for this vindictive, bloodbath of these perverted, weird atheist
Hmm.
Christians. And what they get is this triumph, that's usually prayer and people willingly facing up to the sword or to beast. I guess in the story too, I think it was one of the guys in there said, I think it was in the Passion where he said, a leopard he was gonna, "You just watch, I'm gonna die, and just one bite, it will take me out," and it happened, boom. So you have these moments where it's like there's the triumph, there's no shock.
Yeah.
One of the funny things with the stories of the martyrs too, oftentimes is as a coda to that is that they would go through all these tortures, and God would heal them, and they'd be taken out and tortured again, and God would heal them, and finally, for whatever reason, they'd finally decide just to cut their heads off, and that was it. It was always just sort of
Hmm.
like, yeah, they beheaded them, and that was it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
it's always kind of, I don't know, something strangely, well, victorious and funny at the same time about it.
Hmm.
Not funny,
Yeah.
but haha. But
Right.
anyway, but you're right though, amazing.
The other thing I liked, um, that's a weird phrase.
Oh, I get you.
The other thing that another thing that I underlined, highlighted, is on page 50. At the bottom, it says, Marian Tilly has argued that Tertullian helped people in his network to get ready for prison by means of fasting and other ascetic practices.
Yeah.
And at the bottom of that, it says, I'm not so sure that the wrist, which is always surrounded by a bracelet, will be able to bear the hardness of change with resignation. I have some doubts that the leg, which now rejoices to wear an anklet, will be able to bear the tight squeeze of an ankle chain. And I sometimes fear that the neck, which is now laden with strings of pearls and emeralds, will give no room for the executioner's sword. I just think like I know I've thought as a you know what I like I don't know that we're ever going to experience the realities of this level of persecution that we're talking about. Like I just and maybe that's me by being naive, but I just don't think it's going to happen. And yet, there's a part of me that says I think there might come a day where we're not all going to be walking around with our Bible in our pocket on our phone. Like I'm not a prepper.
Yeah.
Um, could there be a day where we are not going to have access to all the wonderful fancy things that we have? Could there be a day where, and again, like I'm not that guy, so I don't want to sound like I'm that guy. Could there be a day where we're not going to be able to we're not going to have access in the way that we have access to the scriptures? And I think that's what Tertullian is saying,
Hmm.
like we ought to be ready for that day.
Hmm.
And the way to be ready for that day is doing things like memorizing scripture and like all of those things. And I say that as a person that I just don't think we're going to experience the level of persecution on the scale of what we're talking about. And I also think there is a reality though that says, yeah, but I mean, are you ready? Like, if that were to be true, are you ready for that? Like, have you hidden God's word in your heart? Are you really prepared for for a level of persecution for your faith that you can't even imagine because we're so used to something else?
Well, I can point you to recent examples, and the most obvious one to me, in the 20th century was Russia. And I mean, And the problem is, obviously in the West, especially amongst evangelical circles, we don't tend to think of Russia being a Christian nation. I know I didn't, but Russia was Christianized in 988 AD. It's been Christian for 1,000 years. And whether you accept Orthodoxy as Christian or not, that's what it was. And for a lot of reasons, bad things happened. And when you got to the early 20th century, the Bolsheviks came to power, and roughly 100 years ago from right where we are now, what had been a vibrantly Christian nation with its problems, with big problems in its Christian, just like any Christian, any nation that has Christianity in it, went from that to a government that absolutely tortured Christians, like killed without any exaggeration, millions of Christians, shipped them off to prison camps, bishops and priests and deacons and just average lay Christians and theologians and seminary teachers were on the base level made impoverished, unable to keep jobs, exiled, but on the highest level were just taken out and shot, like just line up against a wall and shot and killed. We got tons of records, millions of them to the point where you get like there's a great book called Everyday Saints, which I highly recommend. It's a fun book to read, and it kind of gives you an insight into Russia and Orthodoxy. Where you have in that book, it's stories of a guy who's now is a major bishop in Russia, but he lived in a monastery when he was a teenager, and he converted from essentially atheism. He had no idea who God was, but one day a Baptist student that he knew let him borrow a Bible because you couldn't get Bibles in Russia. People had to sneak them in. You remember probably reading about this, and I know about it too. Nobody had them. The government did an excellent job of wiping all these things out. So he reads a Bible, he finds Christ, he goes to the Orthodox Church, is baptized, and later on goes to a monastery where he's like, what is this craziness? This is so weird, but finds himself falling in love with it. And of course, the story is born out of all of that. So, I mean, I think the possibility of what he's talking about here is it's possible. But as one of my professors in seminary used to say, he's like, don't worry. None of you are going to be martyrs. None of you are that. You don't believe God enough for him to challenge your faith that much. So, and I think there are saints who would say that. But I mean, we know this happens. I mean, it's happened in recent times. It's happening. It's happening now in some places.
Sure, sure.
So, I mean, but I think you're right in one sense, and so I would answer this too by saying, because I made a note here too about this, because I think to myself when I read these stories of the martyrs, like, would I have the guts to do what they did? And my friend Father John Parker, my wife brings this up. I remember him saying this, but he said the proof of us now, and it has a lot to do with what he's saying in this chapter, is would we be martyrs? And he said, well, we're beginning to train for it by our fasting and our prayer rule. So, we have the Lenten fast. We just came out of the Christmas fast that ended at Christmas. We have these seasons where we're not eating, like in the Orthodox Church, where we're supposedly, I mean, it depends on the person you're talking to, because health has a lot to do with this, but no meat, no dairy, and then no wine and no, generally speaking, olive oil. We avoid all these things for a period, not out of legalism, but in essence, to sort of have I mean, it sounds so petty, but like a living martyrdom. I mean, ooh, I can't eat meat, for 40 days. You can live, you
Sure.
can do that. So, but he made a point of saying, that's sort of martyr's practice, and I think the same thing goes across the board. If we're going to church, I talk about that daily prayer rule, stopping to commune with God, to read our prayers, to talk to the Lord, to bring
Right.
to bring these things before him. And then also to getting our body into it. We often do prostrations when we do prayers, like going
Hmm.
right down to our face, making the sound that we do all these bodily things, the stuff that he's talking about in here, all these like physical things, because we want to bring the material and bodily world into what is in our head. We want to get them both together. So that by doing this, this is what Tertullian's saying. Now, Tertullian is not he wouldn't he was a heretic in the end, but he had a lot of good things to say, and he was a super strict. That it was part of his downfall. He was hyper strict about stuff. But his whole point is to say, if we're so busy pampering ourselves, How are we going to be willing to essentially to pick up our cross and to bear our cross and maybe even suffer for it, you know? And I
Right.
think it's scary. It's
Yeah.
like, ugh, I don't want to hear that. I
Right.
just want to wear my anklet,
Right.
and drive my car.
I just like my food.
Yeah, I like my food. I just want to eat my food.
I'm sure it won't be that bad. That's nothing funny to laugh about, but
It's a
it's
good point. That's a good point.
any other thoughts you had from this you wanted to chat
No,
about?
you actually it's interesting because you hit the same things that I was thinking about it too. And I think, I think if it were me when I read this, I'm reading this through the eyes of someone who doesn't have the same approach to how I would look at things, but he's drawing out a lot of things in this that are he says a couple strange things. He talks about the token food of the Eucharist. I thought that was a very strange thing to say, but I get it because if you don't believe it's the body and blood of Christ in a real sense, then of course you're going to call the Eucharistic meal a token meal. But he understood that they placed importance on eating together, but also too to have that spiritual meal together. The two are connected, and that was really, that was it's always been a part of the church. We would say on at the divine liturgy when we're preparing communion, that's the real meal. That's the actual only meal that we really need is Christ. But then we got to live, and to live, you got to still eat. Got to eat your Cheerios. So how are you going
Right.
to do? You know what I mean? How are you going to connect those two things? Like where's the connection between those things? So I appreciate it. Like he talks about the agape meal, which we do every Sunday after our liturgy still, we have what is a not a token, it's the real meal, but then we have to sit down and actually put to work what we learned during the liturgy. Now we actually got to, and most people don't want to. They'll sit down and what'll they do? They'll gossip, they'll maybe complain, and they'll catch themselves, they'll talk about that, they'll come to confession and go, yeah, I just, I did this wrong. So I do, while I differ with his approach to it, I appreciate that he brings up like that was a big part of their, what he's calling their habitus, their tradition. This chapter is so full. There's a lot in
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. The one of the things I liked was just in the very at the very end in the conclusion. Um, the sentence says a few people, initially a tiny number of courageous people, but soon a larger group, looked at the Christians who were often most eloquent when they were not in control of situations.
Hmm.
Man, I just think I am not always the most eloquent when I'm not in control of my situations in living out my faith. I just think that, like, I read that too, and it's such a challenge. Like, how many, like, how often we think that I can't adequately worship the Lord unless, like, the puzzle is complete in the way that I want it to be complete.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the picture that we see of the early church, where they had every single thing coming against them, and yet they were imperfect. Like we
Hmm. Yep.
definitely, my tradition tends to elevate. Like, if we could just get back and be like the early church, well, they are a stinking disaster. Just read the letters.
You're
Like,
already there. You're already
they
there.
they had a lot of things right, and they were a disaster. Like, it was not worth elevating. Yeah, I think you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But I feel like, we tend to reduce things so much to, I can't worship God unless this box is correct. And it says, like I just love that line, like they were the most eloquent when the things were the least in their control.
Yeah.
And I think, golly, that's something we're striving towards,
Yeah.
having that heart, having that mindset. Um, and that only comes with the transformation, and that comes with my, not in a works-based way, but that comes with my cooperating with that transformation. And um, I loved your marriage. You had really two great illustrations that are going to make an appearance someday. Um, but I liked that. I liked marriage as an illustration of navigating that obedience and heart change. That's a really solid illustration of what it looks like to live out our vows, to live out the words that we said. Like, um, that's the thing. That's the way we're eloquent when things are out of our control.
But I would only push back in one sense. I would say, don't shy away from the works there, because
Right.
Christ is
Yes.
he's initiated this stuff to save us,
Right.
and that's
Right.
what Father Thomas Hopko would say. He would say Christ said several things from the cross, but his most eloquent word from the cross was his silence, the witness of his total love for humanity and his silence in death, a death that he chose, and he chose when it would happen, and he gives up his soul when he chooses to give it up. He's not a victim in that sense.
Yeah.
And it's that
Yeah.
silence of, I mean, boy, it sounds real good to say that. I'm like, I have no idea how that actually plays out in my life.
Right.
I'm too much of a sinner, but yeah, I mean, I mean, and that I think that was, if there's a difference between us, my last word, I can't think of the guy who said it, ancient Orthodox teacher, elder, who said essentially, and I don't think I've said this on our podcast, but he talked about, he was approached by some other monks who came to him and said, so tell us, elder so and so, tell us about the people of the ancient times. Well, they were incredible and they raised the dead and they did this and this and this. And he's like, wow. Okay, well, tell us about the people now. So imagine, like, I don't know, 1,000 years ago when he's saying this. Well, now we do about half of what they did. We do okay. Well, what about the people of the future? He said, and that's us right now. He says they won't do anything. They will have no, righteous works. They will basically they'll stumble, in a sense, they'll stumble around to do anything that we did at all and virtually do nothing. He said, but because of the temptations and the difficulties of their time, simply by being faithful and living out to the best that they can in their time, this life of Christ, they will do works greater than raising the dead, greater than what anybody else had done before them. And Father Hopko was always big on quoting that and saying, now is that time. We're challenged by this, so let's at least, acknowledge the reality that we're just the poorest of the servants of the poor servants. But if we can just remain faithful, like you were saying too, like being like these people, like in silence, being eloquent in our silence, so to speak, that we trust the Lord to do the rest of the work. We're not going to save, we're not going to convince anybody to walk into heaven. We're going to do the best we're going to be able to do is to follow Christ ourselves, but we can at least, try to keep people from being dissuaded from it. That's for sure.
Right. Right.
Anyway, my 2 cents.
We did it. We talked about this for over an hour.
We did it. Shocker.
Hey, we are, like I told you this, like I've missed this. So we're just two pastors talking about whatever we want to talk. Well, hopefully, whatever the Lord wants us to talk about. If I were going to
Yes.
spiritualize things, we're talking about things the Lord wants us to talk about. But we are talking about things the Lord wants to talk about. We're talking about things we want to talk about, and things that will hopefully help those of you who watch this just think about your faith and encourage you in your faith. We're spending time this month. We Last Sunday we talked about gathering, and Hebrews 10 talks about spurring one another on to love and good works, and gathering together to encourage one another. So I know it's our hope that you'll find some encouragement in this, and maybe it's just you're knowing that you're not alone in your faith walk, and in your relationship with Christ. And I'm comfortable with saying there are lots of things that we don't have figured out. And if you're a person who doesn't have lots of things figured out, this this would be an okay podcast to watch or to listen to, because we're just two guys who, thankfully, we're in a relationship with the one who has all the things worked out and knows all those details. And I think the Christian life is just exploring and walking along, beside the one who does know those things, and trusting that he does, and being confident in our ignorance and being troubled in our ignorance, and just knowing that Jesus has it all figured out. So thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time on Two Pastors.